The Spanish arrived with steel, horses, and fire. They believed the world bent to their will. But in the forests and valleys of southern Chile, a people stood firm. They did not kneel, they did not flee. They fought. These people were the Mapuche. Their land stretched from the Biobío River to the Strait of Magellan. It was green, it was rich, it was theirs. When the Spanish came in 1540, they expected conquest. They found war. The Spanish were led by Pedro de Valdivia. He was a soldier of the Inca Empire's fall. He had seen empires break. He thought this would be easy. He was wrong. Valdivia crossed the Atacama Desert. He entered Mapuche territory in 1541. He built a fort. He named it Santiago. He claimed the land for Spain. The Mapuche watched. They waited. At first, contact was quiet. Trade happened. The Mapuche gave food. The Spanish gave trinkets. But the Spanish wanted more. They took land. They demanded labor. They spoke of a king far away and a god in the sky. The Mapuche listened. Then they said no. In 1553, the Mapuche struck. They attacked the Spanish fort at Tucapel. They burned it. They killed the garrison. Valdivia escaped, but his power was shaken. The message was clear. This land would not be taken without blood. The man who led the attack was Lautaro. He was young. He had once been a captive of the Spanish. He served Valdivia as a page. He learned their ways. He learned their weaknesses. He escaped. He returned to his people, and he taught them how to fight. Lautaro knew the Spanish relied on horses. He knew their weapons made noise but were slow to reload. He knew they feared ambush. So he trained the Mapuche to move fast, to strike from cover, to vanish into the forest. He reorganized their warriors. He created units. He used signals. He planned attacks like a general. The Spanish had never seen this before. The Mapuche were not just resisting, they were adapting. In 1554, Lautaro led a major attack at the Battle of Marijueño. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers died. Their armor could not save them. Their horses could not outrun the arrows. The Mapuche used the land. They used the rain. They used the trees. Valdivia tried to respond. He marched south with a new army. He thought he could crush the rebellion. But in 1554, near the site of Tucapel, Lautaro ambushed him. The Spanish were surrounded. They fought hard, but they were overwhelmed. Valdivia was captured. Mapuche tradition says he was executed. Some say he was killed in battle. Others say he was put to death as punishment for his crimes. No one knows for sure. But his death marked a turning point. For the first time, a Spanish governor had fallen to an indigenous army. The news spread. In Peru, in Buenos Aires, in Spain, men read the reports with shock. The Mapuche had not just resisted, they had won. But the war was not over. Spain would not forget. They would send more men, more weapons, more orders from the king. The Arauca War had begun. The Mapuche did not celebrate for long. They knew what was coming. They prepared. They strengthened their alliances. They stored food. They sharpened their spears. They were not a kingdom. They were not an empire. They were a people of many clans. Each ruca, household, had its voice. Each lonco, chief, led his people. But in war, they united. Their strength was not in numbers. It was in will. It was in knowledge. They knew every river, every hill, every path through the forest. The Spanish were blind in this land. The Mapuche saw clearly. They used guerrilla tactics. They attacked supply lines. They burned forts. They avoided large battles unless they held the advantage. They fought on their terms. Spain sent new leaders. They brought more soldiers. They built more forts. But each time the Mapuche responded. Each time the cost was high. By 1557, the Spanish had lost 3 governors to Mapuche resistance. That had never happened anywhere else in the Americas. Not in Mexico, not in Peru. The Mapuche were different. And Lautaro? He did not live to see it all. In 1557, he led an attack deep into Spanish territory. He was ambushed. He died in battle. He was only 27 years old. But his legacy lived on. His tactics, his courage, his vision, the Mapuche remembered. They carried his name into every fight. This was not a short rebellion. It was a war that would last for centuries. A war of survival. A war for land. A war for freedom. The Spanish thought they would conquer in a few years. They were wrong. The Mapuche would resist for 300 years. They would never be fully defeated. This is their story.
In the year 1550, a war began in the forests of southern Chile that would not end for more than 3 centuries. This was the Arauco War, the longest-running conflict in the history of the Americas. It stretched across generations. It defied empires. It reshaped borders. And at its heart stood the Mapuche, a people who refused to be ruled. The name Arauco comes from the Mapudungun phrase ragco, meaning clayey water or wet land. It described the region's damp soil, its dense forests, and its many rivers. This land was not easy to cross. Horses slipped in the mud. Armies lost their way in the fog. The terrain favored those who knew it, and the Mapuche knew it well. The war did not start with a single battle. It grew from a series of broken promises. In 1540, Pedro de Valdivia, a Spanish captain who had served under Francisco Pizarro in Peru, led an expedition into Mapuche territory. He claimed the land for Spain. He built forts. He demanded food and labor. He expected obedience. He did not get it. The Mapuche were not a centralized empire like the Inca. They were a network of autonomous communities, each led by a lonco, chief. They shared language, customs, and kinship ties, but no single ruler controlled them all. This made them hard to conquer. There was no capital to seize, no king to capture. When Valdivia pushed south, the Mapuche resisted. In 1553, they ambushed and destroyed the Spanish fort at Tucapel. Valdivia was captured and killed. His death sent shockwaves through the Spanish colonies. Never before had an indigenous force killed a sitting governor in the Americas. After Valdivia's death, Spain sent new leaders. They rebuilt forts. They brought reinforcements from Peru. They tried to restore control. But the Mapuche were not finished. One of the most important figures to emerge was Lautaro. He had been taken as a child by the Spanish and forced to serve as a page in Valdivia's army. In that role, he observed Spanish tactics, their use of horses, their chain of command, and their weaknesses. In 1551, he escaped. He returned to his people and shared what he had learned. Lautaro did not just fight, he reorganized. He created a disciplined military force modeled on what he had seen, but adapted to Mapuche's strengths. He trained warriors in coordinated attacks. He used scouts. He planned ambushes. He understood the value of surprise and speed. In 1556, he led the Mapuche to a major victory at the Battle of Pitrohuello. He had built a fortified camp near the Cachapual River. When the Spanish marched to destroy it, they found the camp empty. It was a trap. As the Spanish entered, Mapuche warriors attacked from the forest on all sides. Arrows rained down. Warriors charged with macanas, wooden clubs, and spears. The Spanish, weighed down by armor and unprepared for close combat in rough terrain, broke ranks. Many were killed. Others fled. Lautaro did not pursue them. He let them escape. He wanted the survivors to carry fear back to Santiago. This was not just a battle. It was a message. The Mapuche were not disorganized tribes. They were a fighting force with strategy, discipline, and leadership. But Lautaro's time was short. In 1557, while leading an attack deep into Spanish-controlled territory, he was ambushed near the town of Marihueño. Spanish forces, aided by indigenous allies from other regions, surrounded his camp. Lautaro fought to the end. He was killed in battle at the age of 27. His death was a blow, but the resistance did not die with him. A new leader rose, Caupolicán. He was a Toqui, a war chief chosen by consensus during times of crisis. The title was not hereditary, it was earned. Caupolicán came from the region of Pitrofuencan, near the Tolton River. He was known for his strength, courage, and ability to unite different Mapuche groups. In 1557, the Spanish launched a campaign to capture him. They used a combination of military force and betrayal. Historical records, including Spanish chronicles from the time, indicate that a rival Mapuche chief, possibly under Spanish pressure or promise of reward, revealed Caupolicán's location. He was captured near the Andes foothills. The Spanish tried to break his spirit. They offered him freedom if he would submit and help them subdue other Mapuche. He refused. They tortured him. They stretched his body on a rack. They burned him with fire. Still, he did not speak. On February 5, 1558, Caupolicán was executed in the Plaza of Cañete. The method was brutal. He was tied to a stake, and a heavy wooden beam was raised slowly, breaking his back. He was left to die in public view.
The Spanish hoped this would end the rebellion. They were wrong. Caupolicán's death became a symbol of resistance. His silence in the face of torture was seen as an act of supreme dignity. His courage inspired more warriors to take up arms. The war continued. The Spanish built more forts, plazas fuertes, along the frontier. They stationed soldiers. They brought settlers. But the Mapuche attacked again and again. By the 1560s, the Spanish had lost most of their southern holdings. Forts were burned. Supply lines were cut. Travel was dangerous. Then, in 1598, a turning point came: the disaster of Curalaba. On the night of December 23, 1598, a Mapuche war party, led by the chief Belantaro, attacked the Spanish fort at Curalaba. Belantaro had fought under Lautaro. He had spent years observing Spanish weaknesses. He knew their routines. He knew their arrogance. The Spanish governor, Martín García Oñez de Lonola, was at the fort. He was a veteran of campaigns in Peru. He believed the Mapuche were no longer a serious threat. Belantaro struck at dawn. His warriors moved silently through the forest. They killed the sentries. They entered the fort before the soldiers could arm themselves. The battle was short. Governor Loyola was killed. His body was never recovered. Some Spanish accounts claim it was hidden. Others say it was ritually destroyed. Either way, the message was clear. No Spanish leader was safe in Mapuche territory. The disaster of Curalaba triggered a wave of coordinated attacks. Over the next few months, the Mapuche destroyed 7 major Spanish forts: Purén, Tucapel, Arauco, Angol, Valdivia, Osorno, and Villarrica.
These were not random raids. They were planned operations. Each fort was isolated. Each relied on supply lines from the north. The Mapuche cut those lines. They surrounded the forts. They attacked when the garrisons were weak. By the 1600s, the Spanish had abandoned all their settlements south of the Biobío River. This river became the de facto border. North of it, Spanish rule held. South of it, the Mapuche were free. This was not a formal peace. It was a military reality. Spain had failed to conquer the south. The Mapuche had won through persistence, knowledge of the land, and unity in war. The Biobío River line remained for over 250 years. It was not a line drawn by treaty at first, but by force. The Spanish could not cross it without facing immediate resistance. During this time, the Mapuche strengthened their control over their territory. They adopted horses which they captured from Spanish herds or acquired through trade. By the 1600s, they were among the most skilled horsemen in the Americas. Horses changed their way of war. They allowed faster movement. They made raids deeper into Spanish territory possible. They gave the Mapuche a mobility advantage the Spanish could not match. Mapuche warriors used lances, bows, and later captured firearms. They fought in small, flexible units. They avoided large open battles unless they held the advantage. Their strategy was based on endurance, not conquest. The Spanish gave them a name, Araucanos, but the people called themselves Mapuche, people of the land. They did not see themselves as rebels. They saw themselves as defenders of their homeland. The war did not stop after 1598. It changed form. Raids continued. Spanish settlers were captured. Mapuche captives were taken in return. Cattle were stolen. Forts were tested. But the Spanish could not advance. Every time they tried to rebuild south of the Biobío River, the Mapuche destroyed the effort. By the 1600s, Spain had to accept reality. They could not win by force. So they turned to diplomacy. They began holding meetings with Mapuche leaders. These were called parlamentos, from the Spanish word parlar, to speak. The first major one was in Guiyin in 1641. It was the first time Spain formally recognized Mapuche autonomy. The treaty signed there acknowledged the Biobío as the border, promised no new forts, and allowed trade. But Spain broke the treaty. They built forts again. They tried to expand, so the Mapuche fought again. More parlamentos followed in 1694, 1726, 1740, 1774, and 1793. Each time the same pattern: war, exhaustion, negotiation, broken promises, war again. But the parlamentos became a tradition. They were not just talks, they were ceremonies of power. Mapuche leaders arrived with hundreds of warriors. They brought gifts, they demanded respect, they spoke as equals. Spanish governors had to attend. They had to bring gifts in return: horses, tools, cloth, silver. If they came empty-handed, the meeting failed. These meetings were not signs of Mapuche weakness, they were acts of strength. The Mapuche did not need Spanish permission to live freely. They used the parlamentos to reaffirm their sovereignty. And Spain, for all its empire, had no choice but to negotiate. This was unique in the colonial Americas. Nowhere else did an indigenous people force a European power into repeated, formal negotiations over such a long period. The Arauco War was not a single war. It was a continuous state of resistance. It was fought with fire and silence, with spears and speeches, with raids and rituals. The Mapuche did not seek to destroy Spain. They sought to protect their way of life. They did not need to win every battle. They only needed to survive. And survive they did. For more than 300 years, the Mapuche held their ground. They never signed a treaty of surrender. They never accepted foreign rule. When Chile became independent in 1818, the new nation inherited the same problems Spain had faced. The Mapuche were still free south of the Biobío River. Chile tried diplomacy. It tried trade. It tried betrayal.
But the resistance continued. It was not until the 1860s to 1880s, with the use of modern rifles, railroads, and a national army, that Chile finally occupied Mapuche territory in a campaign known as the Pacification of the Araucanía. Even then, the Mapuche were not defeated in spirit. Their resistance during the Arauco War remains one of the most remarkable stories in military history. A decentralized people, without a king or a standing army, held off a global empire for over 3 centuries. They did it through courage, through knowledge, through unity in crisis, and through an unbreakable bond to their land. The Arauco War was not just a conflict, it was a testament to the power of a people who refused to disappear. After the disaster of Curalaba in 1598, the Spanish Empire faced a hard truth. They could not conquer the Mapuche by force. Their forts were gone, their armies were defeated, their governors were dead. The road south was closed. For decades, the Spanish had believed that their weapons, horses, and faith would carry them to victory. But the Mapuche had proven otherwise. They were not a broken people. They were not fleeing. They were organized. They were determined. They were in control of their land. So Spain changed its strategy. Instead of war, it turned to words. They began to meet with Mapuche leaders. These meetings were called parlamentos, from the Spanish word parlar, meaning to speak. But they were more than talks. They were formal ceremonies of diplomacy, power, and recognition. The first major parlamento took place in 1641 near the town of Quillín, just north of the Biobío River. It was a turning point in the history of colonial South America. By this time, the Spanish had been absent from southern Chile for over 40 years. After Curalaba, they had withdrawn completely. The Mapuche ruled the territory south of the river without challenge. They raised cattle, farmed, traded, and governed themselves. Spain now wanted to return, not with armies, but with promises. Governor Francisco López de Zúñiga arrived at Quillín with a delegation. He brought gifts, silver, cloth, tools, and horses. He knew that without offerings, the Mapuche would not listen. Hundreds of Mapuche leaders came. Chiefs from the north, south, east, and west attended. They arrived on horseback, wearing silver jewelry called trapelacucha and yonco trarilonco. They carried long spears. They brought their families. This was not a gathering of defeated rebels. It was a meeting of equals. The parlamento lasted several days. There was food, there was drink, there was music, there was speaking. In Mapuche tradition, decisions were made through discussion, not decree. Leaders spoke in turn. Elders were heard. Women sometimes took part. The process was slow, but it was respected. The Spanish made clear demands. They wanted peace. They wanted to rebuild forts. They wanted safe passage for settlers. But the Mapuche set the terms. They demanded that the Biobío remain the border. They insisted that no new forts be built south of it. They required the return of Mapuche captives held in Spanish towns. They asked for regular gifts, what they called quintus, or offerings, as a sign of respect and balance. After days of talks, an agreement was reached. It became known as the Treaty of Quillín, 1641. This treaty was historic. For the first time in the Americas, the Spanish crown formally recognized the autonomy of an indigenous people.
The Mapuche were not declared subjects. They were not forced to pay tribute. They were not required to convert or submit. Instead, the treaty stated that the Mapuche would govern themselves, that they could trade freely, that their leaders would be respected, that the Biobío would be the border between two powers. This was not a surrender. It was a diplomatic recognition of reality. Spain did not grant the Mapuche freedom. The Mapuche had already taken it. The treaty simply acknowledged what had been true since 1598. The Spanish could not rule the South. But peace did not last. Within a few decades, Spain broke the treaty. New governors ignored its terms. They built forts south of the Biobío. They allowed settlers to cross the river. They captured Mapuche people and forced them into labor. The Mapuche responded as they always had. They attacked. They burned the new forts. They drove the soldiers back. War returned. By 1694, the Spanish were once again exhausted. They could not maintain control. They called for another Parlamento. This time it was held at Negrete, on the northern bank of the Biobío River. Again, Mapuche leaders came in strength. Again, the Spanish came with gifts. Again, promises were made. The 1694 Parlamento reaffirmed the Biobío border. It banned new forts. It allowed trade under mutual agreement. It required the return of captives. And again, the peace was temporary. Spain broke the agreement. The cycle repeated. But something had changed. The Parlamentos were no longer one-time events. They became a tradition, a system, a way of managing the frontier. Over the next century, more Parlamentos were held in 1723, 1726, 1740, 1774, and 1793. Each followed the same pattern. Each was a response to war. Each ended with a truce. These meetings were not European-style treaties signed in silence. They were public, ceremonial events. Mapuche leaders arrived with hundreds of warriors. They set up camps. They brought food and animals. They displayed their strength. The Spanish governors had to wait. They had to show patience. They had to present gifts before talks could begin. If the Spanish arrived without gifts, the Mapuche would leave. No words would be spoken. The meeting would fail. Gifts were not bribes. They were symbols of balance. In Mapuche worldview, relationships had to be maintained through reciprocity. If one side gave, the other had to give in return. This was called Nor Enyun, or the right way of living. The Spanish learned this the hard way. When they failed to bring enough horses or cloth, negotiations collapsed. When they brought generous gifts, the Mapuche listened.
One of the most powerful figures in this era was Vilumilla, a Lonco from the region of Purén. In the 1720s, he led a major uprising against Spanish violations of the 1694 agreement. He united multiple Mapuche groups. He attacked forts. He cut supply lines. He captured Spanish settlers. When the Spanish asked for peace, Vilumilla did not rush. He waited. He made them come to him. At the Parlamento de Negrete in 1726, he set the terms. He demanded the return of all Mapuche captives. He insisted on an end to forced labor. He required that Spanish authorities respect Mapuche laws and customs. The Spanish agreed. But within a few years, they began violating the terms again. Vilumilla did not hesitate. He called for war once more. His actions showed a truth. The Parlamentos were not signs of Mapuche weakness. They were tools of strength. The
The Mapuche did not need Spanish permission to live freely. They used the parlamentos to reaffirm their sovereignty, to gain supplies, and to expose Spanish betrayal. Each time the Spanish broke a treaty, the Mapuche had moral and political justification to fight again. And they did. The parlamentos also created a stable system of interaction. Trade was allowed under strict rules. Mapuche could sell cattle, hides, and ponchos to Spanish towns. In return, they received tools, knives, cloth, and later firearms. Travel was permitted under agreement. Spanish traders could enter Mapuche territory with a pass. Mapuche could visit Spanish towns for trade or talks. But there were limits. No Spanish governor could rule in Mapuche land. No priest could force conversion. No soldier could enter without permission. The Mapuche governed themselves. They resolved disputes through their own leaders. They maintained their language, religion, and customs. This was not full independence in the European sense, but it was autonomy, a self-governing people living outside colonial control. And it lasted. From the Treaty of Quellin in 1641 to the final occupation of Mapuche territory in the 1880s, the Biobío River remained a de facto border for over 240 years. Spain tried to break it. Chile, after gaining independence in 1818, tried even harder. But the system of parlamentos endured. Even after Chile replaced Spain, the new republic continued holding parlamentos into the 1860s. The last major one was in 1869 at Tolten. By then, Chile was preparing for full-scale war, but even as it built railroads and bought modern rifles, it still felt the need to meet and speak. This fact alone speaks volumes. For more than 2 centuries, the Spanish and later the Chilean state had to negotiate with the Mapuche, not because they were generous, not because they believed in equality, but because they had no choice. The Mapuche could not be ignored. They could not be bypassed. They had to be dealt with as a political force. Nowhere else in the Americas did an indigenous people maintain such prolonged diplomatic relations with a colonial or national government. The parlamentos were not peace treaties in the modern sense. They did not end the war. They were truces, ceasefires, breathing spaces. But they were truces on Mapuche terms. The Mapuche did not attend because they were weak. They attended because they were strong. They came not to beg, but to declare, "We are here. We are free. We will speak as equals." And the empire, for all its power, had to listen. That was the real victory of the parlamentos. Not peace, but recognition. A people who had never been conquered now sat across the table from governors, not as subjects, but as leaders of a nation. And for over 2 centuries, that truth held. The Arauco War never officially ended, but through the parlamentos, the Mapuche turned war into a balance of power. They did not win every battle, but they never lost their freedom until the very end. Why did the Mapuche resist so long? Why did they never fall? Other nations fell. The Inca, the Aztec, the Maya. But the Mapuche stood. The answer is not simple. It is made of many things. First, the land. The Mapuche lived in a hard place. Forests, swamps, mountains, rain. The Spanish were used to open deserts and high plains. Here, the trees blocked the sun. The mud slowed the horses. The rivers flooded. The Mapuche knew this land. They moved through it like wind. Second, their society. The Mapuche had no king, no emperor, no central army. Power was shared. Each clan made its own choices. Each lonco led his people. This made them hard to break. Kill one chief, 10 more rose. Destroy one village, others survived. There was no capital to capture, no throne to seize. Third, their economy. The Mapuche were farmers. They grew potatoes, they raised llamas and later cattle. They did not depend on cities. They did not need markets. They could live off the land. When war came, they could retreat. They could wait. Fourth, their warriors. Mapuche men trained from youth. They ran, they wrestled, they fought with clubs and spears. When they got horses, they mastered them fast. They became some of the best riders in the Americas. They did not fight in lines. They fought in small groups. They used surprise. They avoided open battle unless they had the edge. Fifth, their unity. In times of war, the Mapuche came together. They chose a toki, a war chief, to lead. This was not a permanent ruler. It was a temporary leader for crisis. Lautaro, Caupolicán, Pelentaro, Vilumilla, these men united the clans, and the people followed. Sixth, their culture. The Mapuche believed in their right to the land. Their stories told of creation, of ancestors, of balance. They did not see land as property. They saw it as life. To lose the land was to lose the soul. Seventh, their intelligence. The Mapuche learned fast. They studied the Spanish. They copied their weapons. They used their horses. They did not reject new things. They adapted them. Eighth, their patience. The war lasted centuries. They did not expect quick victory. They expected long struggle. They passed the fight to their children and their children's children. Ninth, their diplomacy. The parlamentos were not signs of weakness. They were tools. The Mapuche used them to rest, to regroup, to gain supplies. They knew when to fight and when to talk. 10th, their spirit. The Mapuche believed they would survive. They had survived droughts, earthquakes, hunger. They would survive the Spanish. No single reason explains their success. It was all of them together. And one more thing. The Spanish never committed fully. Spain had bigger concerns. Peru, Mexico, Europe. Chile was a distant colony, poor, hard to reach. They sent soldiers, but never enough. When the Mapuche fought hard, Spain pulled back. The Mapuche knew this. They pushed when weak. They waited when strong. They did not need to win every battle. They only needed to survive. And they did. The Arauco War did not end with a treaty. It faded. By the 1800s, Chile became independent. The new nation wanted the Mapuche lands. They broke the old border. They built forts. They sent armies. The Mapuche resisted, but the world had changed. Guns were stronger. Armies were larger. By the 1880s, the Chilean army occupied the land, but even then, the Mapuche were not conquered. They had fought for over 300 years. No other indigenous people in the Americas resisted so long. They never signed a treaty of surrender. They never accepted foreign rule. Their fight was not in vain. They kept their language, their customs, their identity. They remembered Lautaro, Caupolicán, Pelentaro. They remembered the parlamentos, the battles, the land. And they passed it on. Today, the Mapuche are still here. They live in Chile, in Argentina. They speak Mapudungan. They farm, they fish, they teach. They remember. The story of the Mapuche is not just about war. It is about dignity. It is about the right to exist. It is about a people who looked at an empire and said, "This is our land. You will not take it." And for 300 years, they proved it. The Spanish came with fire. The Mapuche stood with Earth, and Earth endured.